The United States has a really large infrastructure and is capable of making large machines relatively easily. Think like cars, hydraulic systems, other large machinery. We have plenty of factories that are able to pump these things out. Indonesia, on the other hand, has over 250 million people on all of these small islands, which means it has a lot of people and not a lot of capital there, but it does not have a lot of machinery. So you have all these people and not as much machinery to make capital-intensive goods. So let's take a look at the production possibility of these two different goods. We've got cars and we've got penny blossoms. We'll consider these as the only two goods in the world to make it a little easier to start talking about international trade. So here's the PPF for the United States. We have our production schedule. We can make 100 cars, and if we make 100 cars, we will be able to make 0 penny blossoms. And as we move on down, we can make 90 cars, which would be 150 penny blossoms. And as you should remember, we can plot this over here on the PPF. Here's 100 cars and 0 penny blossoms, 90 and 150. And over here we have 500 penny blossoms and 0 cars. We can do the same thing for Indonesia. Here we have the production possibility frontier, and we have their production schedule, just like this. And we can do both of these on one PPF, just like we did when we were talking about individuals. We can do the same thing for different countries. So it should be very easy to see that, hey, Indonesia has a absolute advantage in penny blossoms because they can produce 1,000 and the United States can produce 500. And the United States has an absolute advantage in cars. We can produce 100 cars and Indonesia can only produce 50 at the most. And then to figure out comparative advantage, we could take the opportunity costs. So since we're talking about international trade, we need to talk about the difference between autarky and free trade. And before we do that, we need to know what autarky is. Autarky just means that an economy is self-contained and does not engage in any trade whatsoever with outsiders. This would mean that the country produces everything that it uses on its own. There's no trade at all involved. So if either the United States or Indonesia choose not to engage in trade at all, they'll be considered in autarky. So here we have the PPF for both of these countries if they're in autarky. They're not going to trade with anybody else. They're both in autarky. Let's take a look at what happens when we move from autarky to free trade. So if we look at what's happening in the United States, if they are in autarky, they're going to produce 50 cars and 400 penny blossoms, and they're going to consume 50 cars and 400 penny blossoms. Indonesia will produce 30 cars and 550 penny blossoms, and they will consume what they produce, again, 30 cars and 550 penny blossoms. This leaves the whole world with 80 cars, 950 penny blossoms being produced and consumed. If the United States and Indonesia decide to specialize and trade with each other, the United States will specialize in cars because they have a comparative advantage in cars, and they'll produce 100 cars and 0 penny blossoms. Indonesia, instead, will produce 0 cars and specialize in penny blossoms. So they'll make 1,000 penny blossoms. So you can see here, we have made 100 cars as opposed to 80. We have made 1,000 penny blossoms as opposed to 950. So we've increased the production of both goods. Now the United States is going to consume, they're going to trade away 40 cars to Indonesia. So Indonesia now has 40 cars they're going to consume. The United States will consume 60. And the United States will consume 425 penny blossoms. And Indonesia is going to consume 575. So the United States trades away 40 of the cars they've produced for 425 penny blossoms. That's what they're going to exchange those for. And you can see the United States has consumed more cars and consumes more penny blossoms. So they're better off in both areas. And Indonesia also consumes more cars. They've consumed 10 more cars, and they consume 25 more penny blossoms. So both countries are better off both in cars and penny blossoms. And we've also got more cars total and more penny blossoms total in the market. So just one example of free trade being beneficial to both parties. And we'll talk about some more examples in the rest of the module.